All right, Genesis chapter 11. The Bible has a lot to say about what we say. Perhaps you've noticed that. You go throughout all the Bible, and there's always something about our speech, about what we say or about how we say it. There are a lot of powerful passages in the Scripture about this topic. James 3, I think of that chapter as the most descriptive chapter of the Bible on our speech. It talks about the nature of our tongues and how sharp they can be, how difficult they can be to discipline and rein in. Proverbs is perhaps the most instructional book of the Bible on speech and on what we say. Genesis 11, however, I think is the most influential illustration of speech in the Bible. You may have noticed over the course of our 21 topics so far in our family talk, many of them have originated in the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is a wealth of information on human nature. It, of course, is the first book in the Bible. It talks about the origin of humanity, and there's so much in the chapter about who we are and how we operate. So here we have the number one inspirational and influential illustration of our talk, our communication, and how it impacts us. Genesis chapter 11, verse number 1, "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." So before I read verse 5, I want to make sure you understand the context. Adam and Eve have been created. They have fallen. They've been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Man populated the earth but was very wicked. The imagination of their heart was only evil continually. They did great violence to one another. God judged the earth through the flood, spared mankind through Noah. Noah established humanity, the replenishing of the earth, but they all stayed together. From Genesis 6 to Genesis 11, they stayed together. They didn't disperse and go throughout the world. Apparently there wasn't any Cain and Abel murder or other problems that pushed people away. They stayed together. They all spake the same language, and come Genesis 11, they're all together building a city. Now, what I want you to notice in the first 4 verses, was there any individuality in this new society? Did you read any I's, me's? It was all us's and we's, right? This was a unified world, a unified global system. It was pretty impressive. And it all hinged on the fact that they spake the same language. They were of one language and of one speech. So they're unified, they're accomplishing great things, and they're protecting themselves. They're building this tower because they want to stay together. They don't want to be broken up, which is a noble desire, don't you think? Isn't that what families should want? Not to be broken up, marriages. So what we're seeing here is not necessarily a bad thing from a human relationship standpoint. Now, it's a bad thing from God's position because God said, go throughout the earth and repopulate, replenish. He wanted them to be on the whole earth, and they were sticking together. So God is interested in what they're doing. Verse 5, "The Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down." I like that. That's God's unity right there. "Let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth." So there is a lot to learn in this story in Genesis chapter 11 about God's intentions for mankind regarding this planet. Certainly there's a lot to learn in this passage about man's social tendencies. We like to be with one another. We have a desire to be with people. We're very insecure in our nature, and so to be with people brings security. But what needs to be pointed out in this passage is the undeniable connection between communication and relationship. The two are undeniably connected. They cannot be separated. We see here that when everyone understood one another's speech, they were unified. When they were on the same verbal page, the relationships that they had were strong. When everyone was communicating soundly, their union was strong. And when they all spoke the same language and understood each other, they worked hard to preserve that union. And when God said, I don't want you to be together, I want you to go and populate the earth. I want you to go abroad over the whole planet and populate. That's my desire for you. When he wanted to do that, you realize he didn't have to do much to get them to scatter. In fact, to break up their union, to break up how strong of a bond they formed, God only needed to do one thing. To get them to abandon this great project, this building project of this building, this tower, he only needed to do one thing. To divide them and stop their progress, God needed to only do one thing. He simply needed to disrupt their communication. He didn't have to work some intricate scheme to get them to question one another. He just said, how about I make it difficult for you to communicate, to talk? And so he introduced different languages, whether that be Spanish, German, French, Swahilian, whatever it was, that's what he did. Genesis 11 teaches us that working communications produce a unified, growing, building, and protective society where the sky is the limit. Broken communications produce a divided, separated society, and in this case, they left everything they worked hard on and walked away. They left the building of the city and the building of the tower. In a marriage and in a home, this connection still exists and is undeniable. The stronger the communication in a home, the stronger the relationships in that home will be. The weaker the communications in our homes, the weaker our relationships will be. The better the communication between husband and wife, the better the relationship then between husband and wife. A home where people are communicating on the same verbal page will produce a strong union. It will produce a union that it wants to progress, wants to grow together, and preserve and protect that union. There will be more security and more companionship in a home where there is greater communication. Poor communication in a home will bring the very opposite. Genesis 11, if I were to apply it to the family and in particular to the marriage, I would sum it up by saying this. It teaches us that the husband and wife who don't understand what each other is trying to say will be far more willing to leave the relationship they once were passionate about building. So family talk, what we say, is vividly important to the life and longevity of a family. So we're going to go through 20 in short time, family talk rules for improving family communications aimed at improving family relationships. Now, they can be applied to any relationship, but obviously you'll see they'll be tailored to more so a husband and a wife. And by the way, moms and dads, how you communicate with each other is exactly how your children will communicate with people. That's right. And that's just the way they learn. They learn by how their parents communicate. If you ever come across a sarcastic young man or young woman, I would put all the money I have, which isn't much, on one of their parents or both of their parents being that way at home. So let's go. Number one. You can try to write these down. We can also print these up for you later, but I would recommend writing them down. I would recommend posting them somewhere because by the time we're done, you'll see that these things, if they were in front of us in the course of our daily conversations, and in particular, conflict resolution, we would be far better off by reminding ourselves of these things in the heat of the moment. Number one, don't discuss sensitive private matters casually in front of the kids. I'll just interject real quick here. If your marriage is falling apart or it has fallen apart or you're in serious trouble where the family is clearly disrupted by it, you can and should talk with your children intentionally, not casually, but sit them down and have a serious conversation and let them know what's going on. so that you can bring some security to the children. You don't want to casually make remarks to let your children imagine what's going on. That's not good for them. But don't discuss sensitive, private matters casually in front of the kids. Good communication hinges on respect. And in particular, the person you're trying to talk to. If you don't show respect to the person you're trying to talk to, there will not be much progress verbally. And if you want to accomplish anything with your mouth, you must show that person you're talking to some level of respect. This is not because Aaron Pryor's among us, who's a Marine officer, but I try to think in my mind, who gets away with talking to somebody in a disrespectful way and actually makes some progress in that relationship? And the only person I can think of is a Marine officer. You put yourself in any other situation, when someone's speaking condescendingly to you, does that ever do anything for your relationship with them? No, I think, again, the Marine officer is the only guy that you've got to listen to. But the rest of us, we require some element of respect. And a willingness to bring up sensitive, private marital matters in front of the children puts your spouse in a very difficult position, because it naturally makes them look bad in the eyes of the only people they think they should have unconditional respect for in this world, children. Every mother and father expects their children to respect them because we were the ones who brought them into this world. And if we are disrespected in front of our children, mother or father, we naturally have a hard time with that, and that causes communication problems. So if you bring up sensitive matters in front of your kids where they can hear, trust me when I say your husband or wife will feel disrespected, and that conversation will not go well. The father or mother who is forced to respond to a private spousal accusation or issue in front of the children is naturally going to feel disrespected, because he or she will look bad either way. If they try to explain themselves, well, that opens up a whole can of worms in front of the kids. If they choose to be silent, which they should, they realize they look bad in front of the kids. And they will hold a grudge against you for doing that over the course of time. So the way to discuss sensitive private marital matters is not casually in front of the kids, but carefully in private. Number 2, don't discuss sensitive private matters casually in front of peers. For the same reasons I just indicated, this is an easy way to disrupt marital communications and instead communicate disrespect. I believe there is a place for your peers in your marriage. Your friends, maybe your counselors. If you can trust your friends, they have a place in your marriage, but you have to make sure your spouse is in full agreement with their place in that marriage. If you want to sit around with another close couple and discuss your marriage and their marriage for the purpose of enhancing one another, that's a very positive thing. If you want to discuss your problems with another trusted couple for accountability purposes, that's a very positive thing. If you want to bring your marital problems into a trusted counselor, whether it be a pastor or a marriage counselor or some other elder in your life, that's a very positive thing. But what you don't want to do is bring up these sensitive matters casually in the midst of a party or a social gathering or an activity, because that puts your spouse in a very difficult position. Number 1, either they tried to address it there and look bad, or be quiet and look bad. And again, they feel disrespected. We all want to feel respected by our peers just as much as we do by our children. And when you threaten that, you're going to have a problem moving forward with conversations, all right? Number 3, I told you we'd move right along. Don't say it unless you really mean it. Boy, is this a classic marital mistake, isn't it? In the heat of the moment, we say something very harsh. And then when our body temperature cools down, we say this: well, I really didn't mean that. Doesn't matter. You said it. And in fact, and ladies, I think you probably are a little more prone to this than guys, but both of us are, men and women. But when I talk to men whose wives make these really gross accusations, their response is, if you said it, there's some element of truth to it. If you're willing to say that, then you believe some element of that, and they'll never forget it. They'll never forget it. When you say, I really didn't mean it, no one believes that statement. And if you really didn't mean it, then you shouldn't have said it. I think of the kid, and Those of you who have young kids can appreciate this illustration. I think of the kid who takes a ball and chucks it at his sister, hits her in the head. She's on the ground bleeding and screaming, and you look over to the sibling and say, "What in the world were you thinking?" And they start to, be remorseful and say, "I didn't mean it." What did you mean to do? Like just tap them and compliment them for how nice their hair looks with that ball? What did you mean to do? You had every intention of knocking their head off. But because you hit her in the head, you feel bad about it. That's how adults are. When you say something very harsh, you have every intention to hurt him or hurt her. But when they come at you and say, "Why'd you say that?" you feel bad. So you're better off just not saying something that you don't mean. Amen's work keeps me going. There we go. Number 4. Don't accuse your spouse if you plan to excuse yourself. If you intend on speaking to your spouse about an issue or problem in the marriage, don't have that conversation if you have absolutely no intentions of assuming some level of responsibility. I can't think of any situation where it's entirely the fault of only one party. They exist, I understand that. But in a marriage, I really just can't imagine any conflict where it is 100% the responsibility of one party. It may be 90% him and 10% you. It may be 85 her and 15 you. It may be 70-30, it may be 60-40. But I don't think there's any conflict because a marriage is one where it's 100-0. So I would encourage you to evaluate your role in the conflict first and intend on owning up to your role in the conflict, whatever that may be. It may be minimal, but make sure you're assuming some level of responsibility. And then I would encourage you when you walk into that conversation where you might be accusing your spouse for just reasons, make sure you're not excusing yourself, and then be prepared to hear from your spouse what role you have played in their problems. Don't go into it thinking you have all the answers and you know they're 95% responsible. Be prepared and be open to hearing what they have to say because they may say something that opens your eyes to a greater level of responsibility that you have to take in the matter. Now, you can accuse them, but mark my words, you will get nowhere. You will get nowhere if you put everything on their shoulders. Number 5, this goes along with it, don't use the pronoun you as much as the pronoun we. Using you puts the other person immediately on defense, right? Using the pronoun we brings the other person into the war room where a solution can be found. I think of Tonto. Remember Tonto? They're surrounded by hostile Indians. And the Lone Ranger looks at Tonto and says, "What in the world are we going to do about this?" And Tonto said, "Who said anything about we, white man, right? This ain't my problem. This is your problem." In a marriage, if you ever accuse the other person of being wholly responsible and entirely responsible to fix it, it will not work. But if you approach it with this is our problem, how can we fix this? You're far more likely to succeed by bringing the other person into a solution, a remedy that you're initiating. Number 6, don't be thinking of what to say while your spouse is saying what they think. Don't be thinking of what to say while your spouse is saying what they think. This is a real hard one for us. It's hard for humans to engage the ear and silence the mind for a little bit. We're just always busy thinking about the next response, right? Any conversation, whether it's conflict resolution or casual conversation or dialogue, we're always thinking about what we can say next. And that's a mistake in marriage conflict especially. We can be so inclined to speak, so inclined to respond, so inclined to silence the other party that we fail to learn what the real problem is. In other words, our minds are so busy thinking about the response that we're not learning what the problem is. And so we have to listen to our partner, to our spouse, say how they're feeling and begin to digest it and appreciate it. I kind of wonder if the biggest problem with marital conflict is that couples do not put the effort into trying to understand their spouse. In the heat of the moment, they're trying too hard to silence their spouse. In the counseling I do, this is evident that it's a problem for both men and women. I will say this much, men. God says, dwell with your wives according to knowledge. So you have to know them, and you get to know them by listening to them. Not by listening to yourself, but by listening to your wife. So ladies and gentlemen, don't spend all of your mental energy preparing your comeback that you don't have any mental energy left to hear how your spouse really feels about you and the matter in question. Number 7, don't tell your spouse what they're really thinking. Hear what they're really saying. This is a big, I hope you're not guilty of saying it exactly like this, but what we often tell our husbands or wives after they're done spewing out their complaint is, well, what you're really trying to say is, or let me tell you how you're really feeling. No, this is what you're really thinking. That is a colossal mistake for both men and women. When it comes to communication, hearing is far more valuable than speaking. James tells us to be swift to hear and slow to speak. And the hearing in James is not just about the ears, it's about the heart. Perhaps you've seen this phrase throughout the Bible, he that hath ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit saith. That's a phrase we see in the Bible. And that's not just a phrase of listening to the Spirit of God. That's a phrase that says, hear and then take it to heart. We're not to be just hearers, but doers also of the word. And this doing, it requires us to take into our heart what we're hearing. So when it comes to listening to your spouse, listen to their words and take their word for it. As much as we all think we know everybody better than they know themselves, no one knows somebody like they know somebody. And I wonder if you'd agree with me, dear people, nothing silences a person quicker than condescendingly telling them what they were really trying to say. Anybody ever done that to you? Perhaps your spouse? At that point, shutdown mode. Why am I talking? You know me better than I know me. It's just how it works. So don't tell your spouse what they're really thinking. Hear what they're really saying. Number 8, don't plan on winning the argument. Plan on resolving the argument. There are no winners in a marriage where you approach a conversation with wins or losses. If the conversation, however, is about resolution, you may win. There are no winners in a relationship where one or both parties always has to be right. Something tells me the more experienced couples have learned it's not about who's right or wrong. It's about how do we make this work? How do we fix this? Number 9, don't finish a conversation until there is some level of agreement. Any good peacemaker knows that peace can rarely be achieved in a day. Conflict takes time to resolve. This is one of the problems that ladies especially have when it comes to marriage counseling. They want, after the first session, everything to be better. Because women are relationship enhancers, they're relationship solvers. And so when they say to their husbands in counseling, this is what we need to do to fix it, the next day if it's not fixed, they're disappointed. But conflict takes time. And as a counselor, my job is to get a couple to be patient with each other and with themselves. Especially if you've been married for any length of time. You certainly can't teach an old marriage new tricks overnight. So I would encourage you in any type of marital conflict, when you're having conversations, pursue progress. Don't pursue perfection. Pursue some level of agreement, even if that is the agreement to disagree. Sound communication rests on the idea that some level of agreement should end each conversation. So you may begin talking about a problem. Make sure at the end of that conversation you come to some agreement. But plan on taking time to come to a full resolution. This is something I learned in basketball at a very young age. I was coached and taught whenever you're practicing, whenever you're playing, any type of training session, whether it's in the backyard or in the gym with the team, never end a practice without making the shot. So if your last shot is a miss, you don't want to go back in the house. You want to make sure you make that shot. You always finish strong, finish on a make, mentally get that swoosh in your mind. A team should never leave practice until you make it. So a lot of times coaches will say, all right, guys, line up on the free throw line. We're not leaving until we make a shot. And if the bus is coming, we better hurry up and make a shot because you finished on some type of make. And in your marriage, it would be sound advice for you to make sure you conclude every conversation, not with a perfect solution, but some level of agreement so as to produce some level of progress. Some level of progress. And that's how I counsel in case you want marriage counseling. We're not going to solve your problems in one session, but we're going to come up with some type of agreement after each session. Number 10. You didn't think I could do it. We are on track. Don't disregard perception or see it as irrelevant. The golden rule of mediation as well as marriage counseling is this: perception is reality. So I really don't care how you really think the situation is or how you really say it is. I've got to convince you that perception is reality. So if your spouse thinks you don't love them, you can tell them all day, but I really love you. You obviously have failed to convince them of that. The perception is you don't. And don't disregard that. Oh, you're just being ridiculous. Of course, you know I love you. That's a mistake if you downplay that perception. In the corporate world, if a product is perceived poorly, if a product has a bad reputation on the market, you know what the company does not do? They don't run commercials that try to convince you it's a good product by just saying, it's a good product. Don't believe all the critics. It's a good product. Don't listen to so-and-so. It's a good product. They don't do that. They send out a whole new campaign to change perception. They don't have to change the product. It's a perception campaign. And so, too, in your marriage, you have to appreciate perception. In your family, this goes for children. If your kids think you hate them, don't just keep saying, I love you. You'll learn one day. You'll know that I love you. You have to change that perception. You have to do some things differently to convince them of that. Never put down how somebody feels as crazy. What will they do? They won't talk to you anymore. If they don't talk to you anymore, Genesis chapter 11 teaches us what? They'll walk away. Number 11, don't waste time defending yourself. Instead, spend time solving the problem. Our nature, I talked about this briefly in Sunday school this morning, our nature is to defend ourselves at all costs. When we're accused of something, it may be a small accusation, a big accusation. It may be constructive or destructive criticism. We all go into this incredible self-preservation mode, and we defend ourselves at all costs. To the death, we will defend ourselves, blame everybody else, find something else to blame, but we are defenders. And sadly, in doing so, we do it at the expense of helping others, helping ourselves, helping our family. And we waste more time in our communications defending ourselves instead of working toward a solution. Now, you may need to explain yourself to help the other person understand why you do what you do or why you feel the way you do, but it's one thing explaining yourself for the purpose of solving the problem. It's entirely a different thing defending yourself for the purpose of preserving your pride. So don't waste time defending yourself unless in some way the explanation will help your spouse come up with a solution. Number 12. Don't speak about yesterday at the expense of speaking about tomorrow. Isn't it interesting? I was thinking about this and preparing the lesson. We decorate our homes with memories of the past. We have pictures of our families, of ourselves, of trips, vacations. Why is it we never put up pictures of bad situations? Why isn't it we don't find a situation in our past where our marriage was poor, our kids were at odds, the kids are fighting? Why don't we blow that up on an 8x10 and put it over the chimney or over the fireplace? Why don't we do that? Because we don't want to be reminded of that, right? Yeah? Don't go quiet on me now, right? We don't want to remember the bad times, the bad memories. We want to remember the good times, the good memories, right? So then why in our conversations are we so quick to bring up these bad memories? Why do we revisit them over and over when it comes to marital conflict? I would argue it's to hurt the other person. If you want to bring up the past, that's fine. It has a purpose. It has a place. It should be to learn from the past, apply it to the present so that you can have a better future. So if you have to revisit the past, make sure it's only for the purpose of applying it to the future, and then focus on the future. Focus on moving forward and leaving it in the past. We need to learn to keep the good memories alive in our homes and kill the bad memories. I realize this is tricky because the past often contains a lot of hurt. So I would suggest go back in the past to fix the hurts and then leave them there and go forward. Number 13, don't suggest the impossible unless it is based in hope and faith. Don't suggest the impossible unless it is based on hope and faith. What do I mean by that? Well, I've been in some conversations where one spouse will come up with a solution, a remedy to the issue at hand. And you hear it and it's like, whoa. Yeah, so no one here can walk on water. How can we fix this? Well, you could walk on water. Yeah, those type of solutions are very discouraging. If you ever have marital conflict or any type of relationship conflict, and we sit down to try to come up with a solution, don't suggest something that the other person cannot do. Because then you're communicating the following perception, and it's not a good one. If you ask somebody to do something they can't do, you are telling them that you're not pleasable, that you're impossible to please. If you're telling that to a guy, then he doesn't need a lot of motivation not to try. So make sure that the solutions you come up with are possible, they're attainable. Now, I think there is a place for the impossible, though, in marital conflict resolution and our conversations in general. I think that's when you involve God. So if you're going to put something out there that's impossible to do, make sure you do it with, hey, honey, God can fix this. Let us have hope and faith in God. Let's attain the impossible. Let's get over this improbable issue before us, this challenge. And now you're putting the responsibility of the impossible on God's shoulders, not your spouse's shoulders. Because I realize some of the situations you might be in today seem impossible. They seem like there's no reasonable solution. Everywhere I turn, it's just too difficult to get over these problems. But when you involve God, it could be possible, because after all, we're supposed to believe in the God of the impossible. Amen? Number 14, don't resist compromise. The only time you don't need to worry about compromise is when you're living on an island in the middle of nowhere. Does anyone live on an island in the middle of nowhere? Hey, if you have one other person in your life, I don't care who they are, compromise is a reality, something you have to realize you're going to have to embrace. That's what makes human relationships tick. Compromise. In fact, the only relationship I can think of between two or more people that doesn't require compromise, it's called a dictatorship. Now, I don't want to be in a dictatorship, do you? But if you want to be in a relationship, compromise is going to be necessary. There is no such thing as a relationship without compromise. So when you approach any type of conversation, if you're not willing to make some element of compromise, don't waste your breath. Number 15, these next 4 are very simple truths that I included here so that you might have them somewhere, either in your mind, in your Bible, on your fridge, on your dresser, somewhere where you can see them, because as you're going through conversations and emotions are involved, and sensitivities involved. You want to do a reassessment before you start speaking, before you take the conversation too much further. The first of these final few things is don't let pride prevail over humility. So as you're having this conversation or you're beginning to develop a communication trend with your spouse or with your family member, ask yourself, is pride winning over humility or vice versa? You know, Proverbs 13:10 says, only by pride cometh contention. I'm so glad that verse doesn't say pride results in contention. It says only by pride cometh contention, which means wherever there's tension and contention, there's pride. And you have to own up to that to some level, you and the other party. So that verse tells us pride creates and sustains contention. With some simple logic, I would like to suggest the following then. The root of resolution is humility. If pride creates and sustains contention, then humility creates and sustains peace. So if you want the conversation to, dissipate into a more peaceful conversation, you've got to eliminate pride. You've got to introduce humility. It's entirely up to you. It's entirely up to your spouse or your family member. Number 16, that is, don't let passion prevail over reason. I think passion's a good thing. I have to say that because there's Italians among us, and we know Stetson Plank says they're very passionate people. But passion is great. Life without passion is boring, isn't it? It's colorless. Passion's fantastic. Could you imagine if I never showed any passion from the pulpit? You have a hard time staying awake for 5 minutes. You'd be gone in 30 seconds. Passion's so necessary for life. But when it comes to conversations that mean a lot to us in the home, passion without reason is dangerous. Emotions do not choose words carefully. Maybe you've seen this. Emotions do not make decisions rationally at times. And in conflict resolution, passion tends to override reason and create more problems. So I would offer a general rule for homes. Let passion govern the fun side of things, and let reason govern the difficult side of things. Do the good stuff, the fun stuff passionately. But when you've got to have communications that require difficult matters and compromise, set passion aside, engage reason. She is far better at it than passion. Number 17, don't let hyperbole prevail over honesty. I didn't learn a lot in English grammar school, not because of my teachers, but I just don't have a good memory. One thing I'll never forget is the definition of hyperbole. It perhaps is my favorite literary tool. Hyperbole is exaggeration for effect. And if you know me, I love this tool. Love it. I do. Because you get the point across, a little ridiculously, but you get the point across. The problem is you can't employ this into your marriage. We all do it. You know how we do it? We use 2 words. Never and always. So when you're having this dispute, one of you inherently will say to the other one, you never do ... Or you always do this. Those words are a mistake because those aren't true. Nobody does the same thing every time, all the time. They may do it 99% of the time, but no one does it every time, always and never. Those words are so detrimental to a rational conversation. I've seen it in counseling over and over. When someone throws those words out, the other person in the chair rolls their eyes and shuts down because they think it's not fair, and most times it's not fair. Hyperbole is a great literary tool, but it is a terrible tool for marital conflict resolution. So I would say speak truthfully and accurately, or else you'll hurt your partner unnecessarily. Honesty is always the best policy because accurate information allows for accurate resolution. Number 18, don't let anger prevail over charity. You have to ask yourself, when you're talking about difficult things, you're going through conversations about the operations of your home, family, and marriage, ask yourself, who's winning here? What is winning here? Anger or love? Wrath or charity? Anger is very easy. We don't have to work hard at that. So it's easy to take over a conversation or a whole spirit. And that's a mistake. That's why Paul said, let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Don't hold on to it. It'll kill you. But you can go to 1 Corinthians 13, and Paul doesn't say a single bad thing about charity. He says charity never faileth. So end every conversation, end every day with love, not anger. With charity, not wrath. And you will find yourself being far more successful in your home. Number 19. I've added this today because it's a serious problem. Don't text your spouse when you can be next to your spouse. Texting is a great modern tool. It's really good for logistical purposes. Hey, meet you in 5. When will you be there? Great tool for logistics. You don't have to waste 5 minutes asking what time you're going to be there. It's a great tool to remind somebody you're praying for them. It's a great tool to just say, hey, praying for you today. Great tool to say, miss you. Great tool to say, love you. Great tool to say, I'm thinking about you. Great tool for that. Awful tool to try to resolve any problems. If I could, if you came into the office for marriage counseling, the first thing I would do is say, give me your phones, because we're going to throw them out for the next 6 months. Terrible idea to ask your spouse how they feel about something in a text or to tell them how you feel. Terrible. You know what we need to do in human relationships when it comes to these very sensitive issues? We need to see the face that we're talking to. We need to hear the tone in which it's being said. But beyond that, we need to be able to touch the person we're having problems with. You can't do any of those things across text. Text is black and white letters. That leaves it wide open for you to say, oh, did you see what they said? Did you hear what they said? You're interpreting the tone in which they said it, the spirit in which they said it, and the mood in which they said it. You may think that they're saying something to you out of anger when they're saying something tearfully, that tears are pouring down their cheeks. But you may think they're just red hot trying to get back at you. And then, emoji, you know. And 500 texts later, you've just basically broken your marriage. All over a simple statement. Guys, let me talk to you men. In most cases, when your wife starts to cry, game's over. Okay? At that point, you feel bad. You start to regret all the things you said. You start walking back. And that's typically a very good thing. When you're texting, you don't know if they're crying. Unless for some reason they take a picture of themselves or put a little emoji with a tear. But they typically don't cry when they're texting. They're getting angry because they don't know the tone in which you're speaking. So I would suggest, if it's anything but logistics or kindness, do not text your spouse. You've got to make sure you can see them, hear them, and feel them in those difficult moments. Otherwise, you may be in jeopardy of having a hard heart for no good reason. Number 20. This one's not necessarily a great revelation, but it's so important. I finished with this one. Don't forget that God's ears are open and that His wisdom is available. Communication. God hears every word you and I say. We have to remember that He's always listening. And that should be a tremendous gauge for us to ask ourselves, how does God feel about the way I'm speaking right now? The manner in which I'm speaking, the words that I'm saying, the intent that I have. It helps you dial back a little bit and have the appropriate response. One of humility, one of love, one of reason, one of honesty, all those things we've discussed so far. But at the same time, I don't know how different you are than me, but I have this idea that God's available all the time. And one of the most difficult things for two human beings to do, whether it's an intimate marriage, a close parent-spouse or parent-child relationship, two friends, whatever the relationship must be, I have this idea that God can help us through those challenging conversations. Think of Nehemiah. When Nehemiah was asked by the king, why are you so sad? And I'm just envisioning a husband being asked by his wife, what's going on? And the husband says, oh man, shoot. This is a conversation we got to have. Well, at that point, do what Nehemiah did. God, what do I say? throw up a prayer, God, help me now to choose my words carefully. The Bible says in James 1:5, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, which giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not. I find it interesting that on Wednesday nights when we ask for prayer, some people will raise their hand and say, could you please pray for me because on Tuesday I'm going to sit down with a coworker and I need wisdom on how to introduce the gospel to them. Pray for me because next week I'm talking to my mother or sister about the gospel and I need wisdom on how to speak to them. And those are great prayer requests. You know who I think is more important than your coworker or your parent? It's your spouse. So don't think God wouldn't help you with the right words to speak to your spouse so that your marriage can be strong. Don't forget Genesis chapter 11 where we started. We're going to finish up right there with that same thought. God knows you better than you know you. God knows your spouse better than you know your spouse. God knows your marriage better than you know your marriage. God knows human relationships and communications better than we know it. He knows how to help us through that dialogue. He knows how to give us the right words and the right approach. He can tell us when to speak and when to be quiet. Rely on God in those moments. It may change the direction of your marriage. It may require a little more effort to be listening to your spouse while you're also listening to the still small voice of the Holy Spirit, but listen to the still small voice of the Holy Spirit because He will say, shh, listen, quiet. Nope, don't say that. Bring up this. Tell her how you feel here. Acknowledge your mistake there. The Holy Spirit of God will do that. And the result of God leading our words, far better than us trying to manage these emotions, these thoughts, and getting the words out properly. God is available. His wisdom is available. And we need to let Him guide us in these most important topics. This is family talk. Not an easy thing to navigate through, but absolutely crucial because a marriage that is sound in its speech and communication will have a far greater potential than a couple that is poor in communication, that doesn't speak well to one another, that doesn't understand one another, that violates all these rules we've gone through. That marriage is going to be a lot more challenging. If you understand your spouse because of good, sound communication, because you have one language and one speech, you'll build a tower strong that represents your family. If you can't understand your spouse at some point, you'll leave off building and go find someone else. That's the danger. So this is family talk. Let's stand and have a word of prayer.